And, I think Assange is kind of the, he's sort of like the ultimate example of what happens when the suppression of dissent is allowed to take place without, with impunity, and the way that Assange has basically been put through a series of show trials. And this is according to the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer. Are you familiar with his? Worth looking at, because those of us who've tried to take an objective look at the war on Julian Assange, there's an effort to marginalize us and silence us.
Definitely.
And so Niels Melzer had the case brought to his attention as the UN Rapporteur on Torture, and he had no sympathy for Julian Assange because he too has seen mostly the smear campaigns, and he said that he went into this not completely without a favorable viewpoint, and then studied what had actually happened to him, and he came out of his study saying he has never seen a single individual so persecuted by several democracies who have essentially violated Assange's human rights. The legal system has really been perverted, and Meltzer calls it irregularities have occurred in the law system. To my mind, it's a complete mockery of justice what's going on. If people read about his hearings that have just basically indefinitely confined him without charges against him in order to keep him from, to prevent him from fleeing, but they're also preventing him from preparing for his trial, for his extradition trial. So, the way he has been railroaded for 7 years, really, into, a firing squad is just terrifying. And it's as if we are watching, the worst of old Soviet Russia show trial and an example, or in North Korea, it's like the worst things out there are going on right now under our noses, and it's involved not only the US and the UK, but also Sweden, which was complicit in concocting rape charges against him. And there's a whole backstory to that, but in Sweden, basically the charge of rape includes that your condom burst. And, so it's really on that basis that those charges were filed, and initially against him in Sweden. And this whole story has been concocted. He was essentially told he could leave Sweden by the prosecutor in Sweden. He was waiting to, to have his day in court around that. Charges were on again, off again, depending on which prosecutor got involved too. It's a very weird story, but he was waiting in order to be a part of the process and to clear his name. He was told by the prosecutor he could leave, and the moment he left, they sounded an emergency terrorism red alert on the pretext that he had fled his hearing and his proceedings. So at any rate, Meltzer, the UN Rapporteur, makes all this clear about how Assange has really been railroaded into a firing squad.
Including with the Ecuadorian government too, right? Wasn't there some kind of IMF deal or something that happened right before?
That's right. Yes.
The British police went into the embassy?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it looks like the Ecuador was bought off, and and Assange was spied upon, as well as his attorneys. And
that was insane too. That story that broke about how they had installed cameras, and they had I guess there was a baby that was brought to see him, and they took the baby's diaper to see if there was DNA that matched to Assange. It just was insane.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. And what's really horrifying in my view is that while his attorneys have brought all these things to court, they're just dismissed. And John Pilger, who's one of the journalists, the European journalists, UK or Australian, I forget where he's from, but across the pond somewhere, a very highly regarded journalist who's another truth teller, he makes the point that the magistrates who've been hearing Assange's cases have had huge conflicts of interest in that they are married to, I think both of them were partners with people who are sort of part of the political elite, which is, has been criticized by Assange. So they have, and the whole military, empire that Assange is trying to hold accountable. So they have very personal stakes in this, and it's really outrageous that they have not recused themselves and that they've been allowed to really conduct kangaroo courts. So this is really terrible, and I really encourage people to go to, to the Assange websites or to Meltzer's website, the UN Rapporteur, and and make your voice heard. We can't allow this to happen.
It's great too that there are people speaking up. I mean, Roger Waters from Pink Floyd, he's been really vocal about this, and there's been demonstrations. So it is great. If Assange is extradited to the U.S., do you think that he'll also face a kangaroo court here?
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, it's known that his case is going to be heard, I think, the same place where Chelsea Manning's case is heard. Some court, I think in Virginia, that is known to, they just lock them up and throw away the key in these kinds of whistleblower security cases. And Chelsea Manning is certainly another one who's been just horrifically treated, is really, kind of doing double jeopardy right now, in prison again, basically being held in solitary confinement. I think she's also being charged like $1,000 a day. I mean, this absolutely punitive punishment that she's enduring for refusing to cooperate with the grand jury that's trying to railroad Julian Assange, into espionage convictions.
Yeah, it is really sad. I mean, it seems like all Julian Assange is trying to do is, be a legitimate journalist, be a legitimate voice for truth, and he has just been endlessly persecuted for that crime. It's really just a tragedy of our era.
And it's shocking what he has exposed, too, that he, and all the media that's, the corporate media that's failing to come to his attention has really benefited from the material that Assange put out, really exposing lies, war crimes, just incredible transgressions on the part of power, and how whistleblowers are supposed to be a part of the system. That's a part of how we hold power accountable.
Yeah, look at how they're glamorizing this Ukraine gate whistleblowers. There's such a double think on that, because they're glorifying them, but not Assange, not Chelsea Manning, not Edward Snowden, not all of these other folks, Bill Binney. There's so many, and
John Kiriakou,
yep,
as well. Yes, I mean, these people who've been heroic in standing up against Edward Snowden, of course. People who have stood up to defend our basic fundamental liberties are now paying the ultimate price. And that includes Chelsea Manning too. It is not a good sign. And, to my mind, these crises are kind of converging. We have a real crisis of democracy. We have a crisis of our civil liberties. We have a crisis of our climate. We have a crisis of concentrated power and economic wealth and inequality and racial injustice. And it's not just hitting in the U.S., it's hitting all over the world. And what are we seeing? We are seeing people out in the streets like really never before. What was it yesterday? Over 1 million people out in the streets in Chile. What are they protesting in Chile? The same neoliberal system that's basically been inflicted here and around the world.